Yes, we are now recording. Okay. Thank you so much for your coming today, Mr. Jack, the Elliott Jr. You completed and published your new book, this one, and To the Ramparts of Infinity, right?
Right.
Yeah,
So
this is a very interesting book, and I read some of that, and I found that your attitude to the William Faulkner's great-grandfather is very new or very interesting for me. Actually, I very interested in the William Faulkner's great-grandfather, and I've researched a little, and I find that, the William Faulkner's great-grandfather have maybe main four actually the resources about him, in the you have already mentioned about that in your book also, and I found that these four books are actually mentioned. The William Faulkner's great-grandfather is a kind of the bad guy,
Yeah.
He is a kind of the egoist, He is not so good
Yeah.
for the people. But your attitude is a little different from that, I think, I think so. It's a very interesting for me, and if you can, could you explain me what kind of the attitude you had in your book, or how do you think about William Faulkner's great-grandfather?
Well, of course, I went through an enormous number of newspapers, reading all sorts of accounts, many of them just snippets of what he did on a certain day. And after a while, you sort of begin to feel like you know the guy. And this talk about him being an egomaniac or megalomaniac don't fit the picture of him, because he was very driven to do things, certainly. But at the same time, I think he had a compassion for others, and had a very self-deprecatory sense of humor. He'd make fun of himself. They always talk about these people like that fought during the Civil War being very obsessed with their accomplishments and everything. And I remember in, I believe it's in Rapid Ramblings in Europe, he was talking about his Civil War experience. And he referred to himself as watching the battlefield from behind a tree.
Oh, yeah.
And of course he's exaggerated, but he makes himself look funny, but he does it not in a vainglorious sense. In another one, he would have led the charge in fleeing and everything. So he's very self-deprecatory. He could laugh at himself, and that to me is against the notion of what a egomaniac is.
Yeah, it's a kind of he is actually looking himself a little kind of the distance from his own self, It's a kind of the humorous, and also he's actually a kind of the looking at himself as a kind of the character in the movie or character in the novel, right? Oh, right. It's a very interesting, and actually, you think that during the Civil War, he is doing his own actually commands for the people, or some kind of for his relatives, or how do you feel about that? He is doing it without his own demand, without his own egoistic motivation about that.
Well, how he thought, I guess he wasn't afraid to laugh at himself.
Oh, yeah.
And see a sense of humor in it, although during the war he tried to accomplish things, but in retrospect he could kind of see himself in a perspective of eternity, subspecie eternitatis, in which you kind of see that you weren't that great, and it even exaggerate his badness. Make himself leading the charge and fleeing from the enemy, or he watched the battlefield but behind a tree.
Yeah.
He's probably exaggerating himself to look more ridiculous, but he wasn't so obsessed with his own image.
Yes.
That his image is so great, this untarnished sense. He didn't see himself as that.
Oh, that's right. So I also feel such a kind of the obsession about his eternity, or kind of his perpetuality of his own full life, you know. It is a very typical mindset, I think, in the 19th century Southern Cavalier people, He is always imagining some kind of the heroic deeds in the fields, and he is always dreaming to be a kind of be killed in the field, or being battled very bravely in the field. It's a kind of the very typical attitude, I think, right? Yeah. So in such a kind of the brave activity in the civil war, but after that he is actually moving to a kind of the business field. He is trying to be a kind of the part of the owner of the Ripley Railroad, right? So do you think about that his a kind of the vision about the future is much more broader than the other people, much more or ambitious?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right, actually.
It was very ambitious.
Yeah.
In building that railroad down here, nobody could build a railroad.
Right. So,
and he worked on it. They tried before the Civil War, they tried to build a railroad to Ripley, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't get the finances. And finally, after the war, Colonel Falkner gets in on it, and he gets the thing rolling, and just about the time they're beginning to build the railroad down to Ripley, he comes out with a new incorporation, which the railroad's charter stated that it would become an intercontinental railroad. Right, yeah. Who would have thought such a thing, that a little railroad from Middleton, Tennessee, down to Ripley, Mississippi, which is only about 25 miles long, about 40 kilometers, turn that into an intercontinental railroad?
It's a very amazing idea about that, Yeah. He is a kind of thinking about connecting the small town Ripley to the everywhere, through the international railroad, right? So that's actually a very clear or brilliant vision about the future. And at the same time, I think that he is not so rich at that time, to begin with the railroad, So maybe he became a kind of the part of the co-founder of the Ripley Railroad, right? I think so. And how he became a kind of the much more big man, finally, about the ownership of the railroad of the Ripley.
How did he become that?
How they become it?
I think he had the vision in there, but he was also able to work with people. I think that people liked him.
Oh,
he wasn't just this tyrant, pushing things through. He could get down there and talk to the common man, and he could get their support.
Yeah.
That last election he was winning.
Oh, yes.
He won it just way ahead of everybody else. He had 4 opponents, and yet he had more votes than everybody else. And this was a local election, so most of the voters knew him, or they knew somebody that knew him, and
that's right.
I think he had really gained their support.
That's right. But at the same time, he has actually many friends, but also he make many enemies inside of the local area, right? So
had some anyway. They weren't that many, but
it means that they failed to get the control of the Ripley Railroad and the the dominance of this area, right? So that actually causes some kind of the murder accident of the finally. But how do you feel about that? So many people hate him also. Or
not that many hated him. He had a few enemies.
Yeah. Right.
R.J. Thurman didn't like him. But I think that Thurman, they really fell out when Falkner was trying to get this actually trying to turn that Ripley Railroad into more of an intercontinental thing, and which was going to be a gamble. And Thurman was not a gambler with his money. He was very tight. He was a good investor, but he thought that was just a fool's errand to try to get in on this Gulf and Ship Island scheme, which he was doing in 1886. And the funny thing about it is that the Gulf and Ship Island venture turned out to be a disaster for everybody but Falkner. He turned it into a win for himself.
Wow, yeah.
But
it's a heroic kind of the action to that, you know.
I think Thurman is just the opposite kind of a personality than Falkner. Falkner is a visionary.
Yeah, right.
Willing to take risk. Thurman was only willing to take good risks.
Yes.
And he was also not a very likable person. He was kind of didn't socialize with others, whereas Falkner did. And anyway, Falkner would round up ridiculing him. That's what brought on a lot of the fights, I believe. Some of the fights that built up this tension between them.
That's right.
Because Thurman was just he was not the center of attention at some social thing. He was sitting over there looking around, you know, and not having much to do with anybody. And Falkner would come in and make some joke, you know, at Thurman's expense. And that built up a lot of tension. And then on the last day, November 5th, 1889, Falkner was going around the square talking to everybody. You know, he was a center of attention. And so he probably went up there to say something to Thurman like, you know, look where we've come to today, Dick, you know. Where are my dreams going? You know, I'm just moving along. And Thurman, just very hot-headed, pulls out a gun and shot him. It's totally unwarranted. He tried to make it out like it was self-defense. It wasn't. He was just angry.
Yeah, right. That's true. So, because of such a kind of the tragic things, and after the, you know, the even his death, you know, some people still, you know, hate him. You know.
Yeah.
So.
But you know, there's a funny thing.
Yeah. Actually, and
I've mentioned it in there that there's a Thurman was born about that time in 1892 or something like that, shortly after Colonel Falkner was murdered. It was apparently a different group of Falkners, but he was born in Ripley, and his parents named him Colonel Falkner Thurman.
Oh.
It's like they were making a statement, you know, like we were saying, we might be Thurmans, but we're not those Thurmans. Right. We like Colonel Faulkner, so we stuck his name onto there, Colonel Faulkner Thurman.
That's right. It's a very interesting episode about that.
You know, in the book story Barn Burning, Faulkner had that character, Colonel Faulkner Snopes.
Yes.
And I wonder if Faulkner may have thought about that. He might have known about this Colonel Faulkner Thurman.
Also, you know, I think in the end of the Ravers, you know, the Hoganbecks, you know, Boone Hoganbecks, newborn baby gets the white person's name, you know, to that, and it's a kind of the very, you know, the typical pattern or some kind of, you know, getting some names from the respectable person is a very typical pattern for the Southerners, right? Oh, yeah. So it seems very strange for me, but it's a very interesting ending, you know, in any way, you know, as a kind of the novel or as a kind of the short story. So it's a very interesting. And but at the same time, you know, even after his death, for example, the Thomas Felix Hickerson publishes the book, The Falkner's Feud. Falkner's Feud. Yeah. I have read that, and I'm so interested in this book. You know, he is actually writing about the W.C. Falkner's life as a kind of the enemy of him, you know, very negatively written it, and but at the same time, it is very interestingly tells me that what kind of the situation they are, you know, what kind of the tension they are having between them, as a kind of the enemy's side. And actually, this Hikason is depicting that William W.C. Faulkner is a kind of the arrogant but intriguing person, you know. How do you feel about this expression? Is he a kind of the very arrogant person, W.C. Faulkner, you know, or the intriguing at the same time? Or loving,
He's
you know.
He's very arrogant.
Arrogant?
Well, that would have.
Arrogant, yes.
I think you have to consider the context of who's speaking that. I think so. The way you see people has a lot to do with your own background and your own relationships to them. So, what he took is what he described as being arrogant. Probably to many others wouldn't have been considered to be that.
Right. But and also I think that such a kind of the arrogant person is actually completing his own planning about the railroad, and also he is maybe finally became a top of the railroad company, right? Or the president, can I call it? A kind of the president of the Ripley Railroad.
Falkner was only president.
Only president, oh yeah, right. It's a very great achievement of that. How do you feel about this relationship between the railroad and the Faulkner family? Is it a very strong, or it's just a kind of the part of his own ambitious plans?
I think it's just part of them. I mean, they grew up with it, and his son wasn't that interested in it. I mean, he became president after his father's death, but he wasn't that terribly interested in it, and that's why he just didn't have the time and money really to invest in continuing it on. There's this story about Murray Falkner wanting to buy the railroads. Are you familiar with that? And I think that's nonsense.
So
Murray Falkner never had the money, and the family wouldn't have even seen him as a possibility because they were looking at selling it to a bigger company that could then continue the railroad on. And Murray Falkner, I mean, he would have been doing good to just purchase it, but he didn't have the capital to continue constructing it, and the family was looking at the best sale would be to someone who needed to see it as a beginning of that longer railroad vision.
That's true. So in a way, so W.C. Faulkner's son actually sells the Faulkner's railroad, and also he make a money and he became a banker, right? So it's a kind of the very symbolical changing of the business area, you know, from the railroad to the money, you know, the money business. So in a way, it is actually reflecting the kind of the changing of the days, you know, from the material to the money at that time. And I think that the W.C. Faulkner's family is always reflecting such a kind of the movement of the era of the days of the world, I think. So.